Please, just make it quick. I can't take more," she said. But he chose to save her life. Mia's breathing was shallow. She could feel her heart pounding against her chest, but it was like a distant noise, as if the rest of the world had faded away. The pain in her body was overwhelming, a constant reminder of the accident that had left her broken and helpless. Her limbs felt heavy, as though they didn't belong to her anymore, and every movement sent sharp waves of agony through her. She blinked her eyes, but the world around her was a blur. She could barely see, and even if she could, it didn't matter. The landscape around her was a mix of trees, dirt, and rocks, nothing but endless wilderness stretching out for miles. There was no sound except the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the steady, rhythmic beating of her heart, which seemed to echo in her ears. But Mia's thoughts were scattered. It was all so overwhelming, for she didn't remember much about how she ended up here. All she could recall was that one moment she was driving, and then everything went black. The crash had been sudden, and when she opened her eyes, she found herself in a nightmare. Alone, far from help, and badly hurt. Her body felt like a shell. She was cold, and the feeling of helplessness gnawed at her from the inside. But the pain that she couldn't escape from, was the worst part. Psst. Every time she tried to move, the sharpness of it threatened to consume her. The brokenness of her body was something she couldn't ignore. Her ribs ached, her leg felt twisted in a way it shouldn't, and her face was covered in bruises. She let out a soft groan, her voice barely a whisper. But she was sure someone, anyone, was close enough to hear. But there was nothing. The world around her stayed quiet. Mia was stranded in a world that seemed too big for her, a tiny speck in a vast, unfeeling universe. She wasn't sure if she could take it much longer. Perhaps. How much more could she endure? Please, just make it quick. I can't take more, she whispered, barely audible. Her voice cracked. But it wasn't out of fear. It was exhaustion. A surrender to the overwhelming agony and the knowledge that no one was coming. Begged him, but it wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a quiet acceptance of her fate. Mia knew the person sitting next to her could hear her words. He had been there for hours, maybe more. And yet she couldn't remember how long they had been trapped. It could have been days. She had no idea. All she could feel was the weight of her body and the endless pain, and no matter how hard she tried to fight it, she couldn't escape it. Tom was there, sitting beside her. He had been her friend for years. They had shared countless memories, times of joy, laughter, and even sorrow. Their friendship had grown strong over the years. He had always been there for her, through thick and thin. But now, in this moment, she didn't know if she could hold on any longer. She was tired, and the pain was eating her alive. Tom looked at Mia with a mixture of fear and determination. He had no medical experience, no training in saving lives. He was just a regular guy, thrown into an extraordinary situation, trying to make the right choice. And Mia's words, her desperate plea to end it all, made him hesitate. It was the kind of decision no one should have to make. He didn't want to hear her say that. He didn't want to see her in pain, but he knew deep down that what she was asking wasn't something he could give her. To give her the end she wanted would mean failing her. It would mean giving up on everything they had shared. He couldn't do it. Tom had always seen the best in people, and Mia was no exception. But she was strong, resilient, and full of life, even if she didn't feel that way now. He had watched her fight through so much in her life, and he wasn't about to let her slip away so easily. He was going to help her, even if it meant risking his own life in the process. But he didn't know how to help. He had no tools, no way of calling for help, and no knowledge of how to save her from the severe injuries she had sustained. All he had was his will, and it didn't feel like enough. Tom shifted uncomfortably as he looked at Mia. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing second, and he could feel the weight of her pain pressing on his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about the look in her eyes when she spoke those words, when she begged him to end it. "I can't do it, Mia," he finally said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not giving up on you. You hear me? I'm not giving up." But Mia didn't respond. Her eyes fluttered shut, and her breath became shallow once again. Tom reached over and gently placed his hand on hers, trying to offer some comfort in the silence. The sound of his heart racing was the only thing keeping him grounded. He knew he couldn't just sit there and wait for things to get worse. He had to act. He had to do something. Anything. But where could he go? Days. How could he possibly save her without any tools or help? Tom stood up, looking around in a panic. The wilderness stretched in all directions, and he couldn't see anything that could be of use. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. Breath. Should he try to carry her? But how far could they go? What if he made things worse? He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. The situation was dire, but Mia was still alive. And as long as there was life, there was hope. He wasn't about to let her slip away without doing everything he could. With determination, he turned back to her. She was still unconscious, her breath ragged and uneven. Tom couldn't tell how much time they had left, but he knew he couldn't waste another second. He gently propped her up as best as he could and began scanning the area for any sign of help. His eyes landed on a faint trail in the distance. A small glimmer of hope sparked in his chest. Maybe there were other people nearby. Maybe there was a way out of this. "Mia, stay with me," he whispered softly, even though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. He carefully adjusted her position, trying his best to keep her comfortable. "Just hold on. We're not done yet. I'm going to get us out of here." He set off in the direction of the trail, moving as quickly as he could without jostling Mia too much. Every step felt like a struggle, but he kept pushing forward. Mia's life was in his hands now, and he couldn't let her down. As he moved, Tom's thoughts raced. He thought about all the times he had doubted himself, all the times he had questioned whether he was enough. But now there was no room for doubt. There was only action. If he wanted Mia to survive, he had to keep moving forward.
The air grew colder as the sun began to set, and the shadows stretched long across the ground.
The trail became more defined, and Tom's pace quickened. Every step felt like an eternity, but he pushed through, determined to find help before it was too late. But his heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not when Mia needed him. Tom kept walking, the world around him blurring in a mix of panic and determination. Break. His legs were growing tired, but he didn't dare stop. Mia's fragile condition weighed heavily on his mind. He could feel her shallow breaths against his side, her body light but stiff, barely responsive. The silence between them felt suffocating, but he tried to ignore it. They needed help. He needed to get her to safety. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other. He couldn't waste time. Not now. Every step felt like a battle, every movement dragging him farther from the little comfort they had left behind. As the shadows of the forest grew longer, Tom couldn't shake the image of Mia's pleading eyes. "Please, just make it quick! I can't take more!" she had whispered. He clenched his jaw and pushed on, his mind racing. Those words had cut deep. He knew Mia. He knew how strong she was, how she could fight through anything. But this time, the pain had broken her. It made him realize just how much she had been carrying for so long, silently beneath the surface. Tom had always been there for Mia. She had been a constant in his life, a rock during tough times. They had known each other for years, ever since their college days. Back then, Mia had been the outgoing one, full of life, always making others laugh and feel welcome. She had a way of bringing people together, of making every moment feel like an adventure. But life wasn't easy for her, and it hadn't been for a long time. There were times when Mia struggled, times when her smile didn't come as easily, but she kept going.
She kept pretending for everyone else. She never wanted to burden anyone with her problems.
Tom had always seen that in her. He had always admired her strength, even though he knew it was slowly wearing her down. As they walked, Tom couldn't help but think about the day they had met, years ago. They had both been in the same small group for a class project, and Mia had stood out from the very first moment. She had a contagious energy that no one could ignore. Even in the middle of a boring lecture, she had a way of making everyone laugh, making them forget the weight of their work for just a few minutes. She had a heart of gold, and it wasn't just her smile that drew people to her. It was her willingness to be there for others, to listen, to help. But lately, things had changed. Tom had noticed it. The way Mia's energy seemed to fade, how her smile had become more forced over time. She had started pulling away from everyone, from him. She became quieter, more distant, and Tom couldn't figure out why. He tried to talk to her about it, but she always brushed it off. "I'm fine," she would say, "it's nothing." But Tom knew better. He had known Mia long enough to see the cracks in her facade. He had seen her bottle up her emotions, her struggles. And when the accident happened, everything came crashing down. It had been a random, terrible twist of fate. One moment they had been laughing, chatting about nothing important. The next, the car swerved, the world spun out of control, and they were on the ground. Tom's mind snapped back to the present. He had to focus. Mia needed him. He glanced down at her again, her face pale, eyes closed, her lips slightly parted as if she were too exhausted to fight anymore. But Tom couldn't give up. He wouldn't. He would never let her go. The trail ahead grew steeper, the terrain uneven and difficult to navigate. Tom cursed under his breath, struggling to keep a steady pace. He could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath his boots as he carefully stepped forward, his arms gently supporting Mia's frail body. He couldn't afford to stumble now. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint rustle of trees. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the air grew colder and the shadows lengthened. The trail, which had seemed so clear earlier, now seemed like an endless maze, the path twisting in ways he didn't expect. Mia's head rested against his shoulder, her breath ragged and slow. Tom felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had promised her he would help her, that they would make it out of this alive. But as time wore on, he began to doubt himself. What if he was too late? What if they never found help?
What if Mia didn't make it? He fought back the doubts.
There was no room for doubt. Not now. Not when Mia was depending on him. Tom's thoughts flickered back to the early days of their friendship. But it hadn't been easy. But they had always found a way through the tough times. There had been moments when Tom had felt lost, when he had questioned everything. But Mia was always there, a guiding light in the darkness. She had helped him when he had felt like giving up. And now it was his turn to help her. his determination hardened. No matter what it took, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be, he was going to get Mia to safety. Why? She couldn't die like this. Not after everything they had been through. Not after all the times she had stood by him. He wasn't about to let her slip away. Not when she had fought so hard in her life. The weight of her body seemed to grow heavier with each passing step. But Tom refused to let up. He pushed forward, gritting his teeth and trying to ignore the burning in his muscles. His mind raced as he searched for any sign of help. The trail twisted again, and for a brief moment he thought he saw a flicker of light in the distance. It could have been a house. It could have been a group of people. With renewed energy, Tom quickened his pace, carefully navigating the rough terrain as he made his way toward the light. His heart pounded, not just from the physical strain, but from the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for Mia after all. His fingers tightened around Mia's hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Hang on, Mia," he whispered. "We're almost there. Just a little longer." But Mia didn't respond. Her face was still pale, her body limp in his arms. Parade. Tom's heart sank, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He had to push forward no matter what. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. And finally, Tom reached the edge of the trail. The light he had seen earlier was now much clearer, a small cabin in the distance. His heart leapt in his chest as he stumbled toward it, his body aching from the strain. When he reached the cabin, he banged on the door, yelling for help. His voice cracked with desperation. "Please! Help! Desperation! My friend is hurt. She needs help." It felt like an eternity before the door opened, revealing a man in his 50s, wearing a plaid shirt and a worn-out hat. The man looked at Tom with a mix of surprise and concern. "What's going on?" the man asked. Tom could barely catch his breath. "She's hurt. Badly. Please. We need help. Please." The man nodded quickly, stepping aside to let Tom inside. "I got a phone, but it's not much. I'll help you as best I can. Get her inside."
Tom moved as quickly as he could, carrying Mia into the cabin.
He didn't stop to think about anything else, only that Mia was finally going to get the help she needed.
As the man set to work, Tom stood by, his heart racing in his chest. He couldn't relax, not yet. But for the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Mia would survive this. The cabin smelled of wood and fresh air, a strange comfort in the midst of chaos. The man had quickly set to work, grabbing a first aid kit and some blankets. He moved with purpose, but Tom couldn't focus on anything other than Mia. She was still unconscious, her face pale, her body unmoving. Tom sat beside her, holding her hand tightly in his, wishing, hoping, praying that she would open her eyes. The man, whose name turned out to be Hank, worked silently, but Tom could see the concern on his face. He knew it was a race against time. Mia's condition was critical. He had never seen her this way before. Even when things were tough, Mia had always fought with everything she had. But now, it was like the spark that had once defined her was gone. Tom's mind drifted back to the days when Mia was full of life. He remembered their first hiking trip together, years ago, in the mountains. Mia had been excited, her energy contagious. She had encouraged him to push through when his legs burned from the climb. Her voice filled with determination. She had always been the one to lift him up, no matter how heavy the world felt. But life had a way of wearing people down, and lately Tom had seen Mia slipping. The cracks that had once been invisible were now impossible to ignore. Mia had always been the one who took care of everyone else, but she had never let anyone take care of her. She had never asked for help, never let anyone in. Tom had tried over and over to get through to her, but every time he reached out, she pulled away. She had always said, "I'm fine," even when she wasn't, and it hurt him, seeing her push him away. Tom took a deep breath, shaking the memories from his mind. He couldn't afford to think about the past right now. Mia needed him, and that's all that mattered. Hank glanced at him, his face full of concern. "You need to sit down, son," he said gently. "You've been walking for hours." "Let me take a look at her." Tom hesitated, but then nodded. Psst. He was exhausted, his body aching, but he didn't want to leave Mia's side. He couldn't. Not when she was in this condition. "I'm fine," Tom muttered, but Hank's steady gaze didn't let him brush it off. "Sit. I'll take care of her," Hank said firmly. Tom sat in the corner of the room, his eyes never leaving Mia. Hank worked quickly, cleaning Mia's wounds and checking her vital signs. Tom couldn't help but feel helpless. He was supposed to be the one saving her. He was supposed to protect her, and yet here he was watching a stranger work on her. Hank seemed to know what he was doing, but the longer it took, the more Tom's anxiety grew. His hands were trembling, and he had to force himself to sit still. He wanted to scream, to yell at the world for putting Mia in this situation. He wanted to take the pain away from her. He wanted to take it all on himself, if it meant she could be safe again. The room felt smaller as time passed. Tom stared at Mia's still face, watching for any sign that she was improving. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so powerless, but he knew that giving up wasn't an option. He had promised Mia, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Minutes turned to hours, and the room grew darker as the sun set behind the trees. The fire crackled in the corner of the cabin, adding warmth to the chilly night. The silence was only broken by the occasional sound of Hank moving around, checking on Mia's condition. "I've done all I can for now," Hank said, his voice calm but weary. "She's stable for the moment, but I think she needs to be seen by a doctor as soon as possible. We need to get her to a hospital." Tom's heart sank. Hey! He had known the truth all along. There was only so much Hank could do out here in the middle of nowhere. But the thought of moving Mia again, of putting her through more pain, made him feel sick. She was barely holding on as it was.
He didn't know how much more she could take. "I don't know if we can make it to a hospital," Tom said quietly.
His voice was filled with frustration and helplessness. How far is it? And what if she can't make the trip? Hank rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for an answer. "It's a few miles from here," he said after a moment. "But we can't go at the pace you're thinking. We'll need to carry her, and I'm not sure how long she can hold on." "The longer we wait, the harder it'll be." Tom's stomach churned at the thought of moving Mia again, but there was no other choice. He had to get her help. He had to believe that she would pull through. "What about a helicopter?" "Couldn't we call one?" Tom asked, grasping at any solution, no matter how slim. Hank shook his head. "Signal's too weak. We're too far off the grid. It's a real pain out here." He felt like the walls were closing in. He needed to think of something. Anything. Mia needed him, and there was no time to waste. Grasp. Hank must have seen the panic in his eyes because he gave him a reassuring look. "Listen, son, we'll figure it out. But you need to rest. I'll stay with her, and when we're ready to move, we'll go together. Just get some sleep. You can't keep going like this. Tom opened his mouth to protest, but Hank cut him off. You're no good to her if you're exhausted. Trust me. You need to rest. We've got a long road ahead. Reluctantly, Tom nodded. He knew Hank was right. He had pushed himself too hard, and now his body was telling him to slow down. But it was hard to give in. How could he rest when Mia was still so fragile? How could he close his eyes when she was lying there, so close to slipping away? He finally gave in, lying down on a nearby couch. Bed. His eyes never left Mia's face as he tried to relax. His mind raced with thoughts of how to save her, but eventually, exhaustion took over. His eyelids grew heavy, and before he knew it, sleep claimed him. The night was long, filled with restless dreams. He dreamed of the accident, of Mia lying motionless in the wreckage, of the moment he had failed her. But then, through the darkness, he saw her, alive, smiling, reaching out to him. It was a dream, but it felt so real, so vivid. Tom woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced over at Mia, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of improvement. She was still breathing, still alive. That was something. Hank was awake too, sitting by the fire, his hands clasped together. He had a solemn expression on his face, but when he saw Tom stir, he stood up. Ready to move? He asked quietly. Tom nodded, sitting up slowly. Breaths. His body ached, but his resolve had hardened. He wasn't going to give up now.
Not when Mia needed him. They couldn't waste any more time.
He helped Hank gather what little supplies they had. They didn't have much, but they had to make it work. Perhaps. The road ahead would be difficult, but Tom wasn't going to stop. He couldn't stop. Mia's life was in his hands. Together, they carefully prepared Mia for the journey. She was still unconscious, her body weak, but Tom could feel a sense of determination growing inside him. He wasn't alone. He had Hank's support, and he had his own strength to rely on. The air outside the cabin had grown even colder as Tom and Hank prepared to move Mia. The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. Every step seemed to echo with the weight of what was ahead. The rugged path ahead was hard to see, obscured by the fog that hadn't quite burned off yet. Tom could feel the tension in his muscles as he lifted Mia once more, careful not to cause her any more pain. But her frailty made his heart ache. Hank had already packed the little gear they had managed to scrounge together. A few blankets, some water, and a small first aid kit. The cabin was quiet now. The crackling of the fire that had kept them warm the night before, now a distant memory. There was no more time for comfort. There was only the harsh reality of what they had to do. Tom felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. He couldn't afford to waste another minute. The longer Mia stayed in her current state, the harder it would be to save her. He had to keep moving, had to believe that there was still hope. But the fear gnawed at him. What if they didn't make it? What if she didn't survive the journey? Ready? Hank's voice broke through Tom's thoughts. Tom nodded, though his stomach churned. Base. He had no choice but to trust that Hank knew the way. Hank had lived out here for years, away from civilization, but he had always known how to survive. He had been their only lifeline when they had arrived at his cabin. Tom didn't know if they could rely on anyone else. It was just the two of them now, with Mia's life hanging in the balance. Hank led the way, walking ahead on the narrow, winding path that led them deeper into the wilderness. Tom followed behind. Keeping a close eye on Mia, he adjusted her position every now and then, making sure she was still breathing, still holding on. He was afraid to move too quickly, afraid of shaking her. But he knew they couldn't slow down. Not now. The cold was biting, but Tom hardly noticed it. His body was in survival mode now, moving on pure instinct. Every step felt like a struggle, his muscles aching with each movement, but he didn't dare stop. Mia's life depended on him. I couldn't fail her. The journey was slow, and the path was steep and rocky, and every few minutes Tom had to stop to catch his breath. Hank didn't slow down, though. He kept moving, checking in with them only occasionally. His eyes were focused ahead, scanning the trees and rocks for any sign of danger or something that could help. Tom could tell he was doing his best to keep the mood light, but there was no disguising the tension in the air. The weight of their situation was heavy on both of them. Brace. Mia stirred every so often, but her movements were weak and disoriented. Tom spoke to her softly, trying to keep her aware, trying to give her the strength to keep fighting. "You're doing great, Mia. Just hang on, okay?" "We're almost there." It was a lie. They weren't almost there, not by any stretch of the imagination. But Tom needed her to hear it. She needed to believe it. He wasn't ready to let her give up yet. It wasn't long before they came to a creek. The rushing water was loud, the sound of it carrying through the trees. The bridge that crossed over it had long since decayed, leaving a gap that was impossible to cross without help. Tom stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking. They had no choice but to wade through the cold water, and he knew it would be a difficult task with Mia in his arms. Hank glanced at Tom, his face a mask of determination. "We'll have to carry her across. It'll be the safest way." Tom nodded, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to move Mia more than he had to, but Hank was right. The water was too dangerous. They had to make it across. Hank crouched down beside the creek, testing the depth of the water. "But it's not too deep, but it's fast. Be careful." Tom held Mia close, adjusting his grip as he stepped into the water. The cold shock of the creek took his breath away, but he ignored it, focusing solely on Mia. She felt fragile in his arms, so light, like she might break if he wasn't careful. He moved slowly, his boots sinking into the soft, muddy bottom as he made his way toward the opposite bank. Every step was a challenge, the current tugging at his legs, but he refused to let it stop him. He glanced back to see Hank following behind, his steps sure and steady. Hank had already crossed halfway and was keeping an eye on them. Tom could feel the water rising as he moved further in. It came up to his knees, then to his waist, and the current grew stronger. Mia's body felt heavier with each step, but Tom's determination never wavered. He kept his eyes focused on the bank ahead, on the goal. It felt like an eternity before they finally made it across, but when Tom's boots finally touched solid ground, he let out a quiet breath of relief. Hank was already waiting for them, a small grin on his face, as if he knew how much that water had tested Tom's resolve. "That wasn't too bad," Hank said, though the look in his eyes suggested he knew it had been a struggle. Tom just nodded, too tired to speak. Bust. He glanced down at Mia. Her face was even paler than before, and he could see how fragile she had become. Every step of this journey felt like an uphill battle, but he wasn't giving up. He couldn't. They continued their trek, the path becoming more difficult as they moved deeper into the wilderness. Tom's legs were burning, and his body screamed for rest, but he kept moving. The hours blurred together, the sun now fully set and the sky darkening with each passing minute. Mia's breathing remained shallow, but she hadn't slipped into unconsciousness. That was something. Tom kept up his gentle reassurances, speaking to her softly, even though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "We're getting close," he whispered. "Just a little longer." He knew the words were empty, but he couldn't stop himself from saying them. He needed her to hold on, needed her to keep fighting. Every minute, every second felt like it might be their last. It wasn't until the sun dipped completely below the horizon that they finally spotted the glow of lights in the distance. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he saw the faint outline of a house. His pace quickened, and even though his body was screaming at him to stop, he pushed forward, one step at a time. As they approached the house, Tom's legs were shaking with exhaustion. Breaking, he barely had the strength to keep moving, but the sight of the house fueled him, kept him going. It wasn't far now. They would finally be safe. He knocked urgently on the door, his hands trembling as he waited for someone to answer. A few moments passed, and then the door creaked open. An older man stood in the doorway, a look of surprise crossing his face when he saw them. "Help, please!" Tom gasped, his voice cracking. Breath. "She's hurt. She needs help." But the man stepped back, letting them inside. Tom felt the warmth of the house immediately, and for the first time in what felt like days, he allowed himself to relax, even if just for a moment. The warmth inside the house was a relief, a sharp contrast to the biting cold they had endured on the path. Tom carefully lowered Mia onto the couch in the small living room, his hands shaking from exhaustion. But he didn't know how long he had been carrying her or how far they had traveled, but it felt like an eternity. The man who had let them inside, an older man named Sam, moved quickly, grabbing blankets and checking the small wood stove in the corner of the room to make sure it was lit. Round. In desperate, Sam's wife, a woman with silver hair and a kind face, appeared in the doorway and immediately rushed over, her eyes locking onto Mia.
"Oh my goodness, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern as she knelt beside Mia.
"We were in an accident," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "She's hurt. Bad." "Boo." "She needs medical attention." Sam's wife, whose name turned out to be Ruth, nodded and moved to Mia's side. She checked Mia's pulse and her breathing, her hands warm but steady as she worked. Psst. Tom hovered nearby, unable to sit still. His heart was racing again. They were so close to safety, but he couldn't help the gnawing fear that still lingered in the pit of his stomach. Sam went to the phone, but after a few moments of trying, he shook his head. No signal. The storm last night knocked out the towers. "We're a little too far out for the phone to work. But don't worry, I'll get her some help," he said, looking at Tom with reassurance. Tom's heart sank again. He had hoped they'd be able to call for help. He had hoped someone would be able to come and take Mia to a hospital, but the reality of their isolation was setting in. They were still a long way from medical assistance. Ruth seemed to sense Tom's anxiety and looked up at him, giving him a small, comforting smile. "We'll take care of her for now. I have some medicine to help with the pain, and I'll do my best to keep her stable. She's lucky you found us." Tom nodded, but the guilt didn't ease. He felt like there was still more he should be doing. He had been the one to lead them this far, and yet now that they were so close to help, he still felt helpless. Ruth and Sam worked together, carefully tending to Mia's wounds, cleaning the cuts and bruises and wrapping her in warm blankets. They moved with quiet efficiency, but there was a gentleness in everything they did, a sense of calm that Tom couldn't help but appreciate. As the hours passed, Mia's condition seemed to stabilize. The fever that had been rising when they first arrived began to drop, and her breathing became less labored. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Tom couldn't keep his eyes off her, watching for any sign that she might wake up at any more. He had no idea what time it was anymore. The hours blurred together in the dim light of the cabin, the only sound being the crackling of the fire and the quiet murmur of voices as Ruth and Sam discussed what they could do next. Tom sat by Mia's side, holding her hand, his fingers gently stroking her skin. He thought about everything they had been through. The creche, the cold, the hours spent walking through the wilderness, carrying Mia, hoping and praying that he could get her to safety. And now, here they were, in the warm light of a stranger's cabin, with Mia finally receiving the care she needed. Tom's mind wandered back to the moment of the crash, the sudden and violent shift that had thrown them into chaos.
One moment, everything had been fine.
And then, in the blink of an eye, it had all fallen apart. He remembered the sound of the car skidding, the sudden stop, and the overwhelming silence that had followed. He had checked Mia immediately, but she had been unconscious, her body battered and bruised. He had tried to stay calm, to assess the situation, but he had been scared. He had never been in a situation like that before. The only thing he knew for sure was that Mia needed help, and he had to get it for her. As he sat there, holding her hand, he felt the weight of that moment once again. The fear, the helplessness, the uncertainty of whether he would be able to get her through it. He had been ready to give up at one point, ready to let go, but then something had changed inside him. He couldn't let her slip away. Not without trying everything he had. Mia stirred in her sleep, and Tom's attention snapped back to her. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment he thought she might wake up. He squeezed her hand gently, willing her to open her eyes. "Mia," he whispered, his voice soft but full of hope. "Can you hear me?" It was slow, but she began to shift. Her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked a few times as though trying to focus on him. "Tom?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send a wave of relief through him. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now."
You're going to be okay. Mia's eyes moved slowly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings.
She looked confused at first, but then her gaze shifted to him, and she seemed to relax. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and she coughed lightly.
Ruth was there in an instant, offering Mia a glass of water.
She took it slowly, her hands shaking as she drank, but Tom could see the relief on her face as the cool liquid helped soothe her.
You're doing better, Ruth said gently, giving Mia an encouraging smile.
"You're strong! You're going to make it!" Mia nodded slowly, her eyes focused on Ruth for a moment before they moved back to Tom. There was a look in her eyes that Tom couldn't quite read, a mix of exhaustion, confusion, and something else, something that made his heart ache. She hadn't spoken yet, but Tom could see it in her eyes, the pain, the weariness of everything she had been through. "I thought," Mia's voice trailed off, her breath hitching slightly. "I thought I wasn't going to make it." Tom's heart twisted. He leaned closer to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Breathe. You're going to be fine," he said softly. "You're a fighter." "You've always been a fighter." Mia closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep, steadying breath. When she opened them again, her gaze locked with Tom's, and there was a deep gratitude in her eyes. She was too tired to say much, but he could see it in the way she looked at him. She was grateful for him, for not giving up, for carrying her when she thought there was no hope left. For the first time in what felt like forever, Tom allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. He felt the weight in his chest lighten as he watched Mia settle back against the pillow, her breathing slower now, steadier. He didn't know what the future held,
But right now, Mia was alive, and that was enough. Ruth and Sam gave them space, allowing Tom to sit quietly beside Mia as she drifted back to sleep. The night stretched on, the cabin growing quiet again, except for the soft sounds of the fire and the occasional rustling of blankets. Tom didn't feel the urge to sleep. He couldn't. He wanted to be awake in case Mia needed him, in case anything changed. He wasn't going to leave her side. As the hours passed, Tom couldn't help but reflect on everything they had been through. They had made it this far. They were still alive. There was still hope. And no matter what happened, Tom knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't give up on Mia. Not now. Not ever.